No, Disney doesn't fully hate animation. I know I put that in the title, but considering their upcoming films that are coming out this year, of course they would still value such a medium. But of course, talking more and more about live action remakes actually brings up the question about why is Disney not respecting animation as a medium rather than a genre that they can use to recreate these stories. This is why I titled this video as questioning if they actually hate it for what they did recently when other studios have gone on to create interesting new animation for the most part, except recently to come out at the end of the year. They have all been relatively the same in Disney's case, keeping up with the more realistic style that Pixar has done, and of course linking more and more to the announcement of Moana that the film isn't even a decade old at this point, or even the recent casting of Lilo and Stitch being another film that came out during the 21st century. Newer stories that are inching closer and closer to getting remakes. And as my past videos prove, there are just so many ways to question and answer each of their decisions, hence why I separate them into different topics, where I really want to begin this video to harken back at the likes of Treasure Planet and what they did to sabotage the film. This is a film that of course is now speculated to be infamously sabotaged by none other than Disney themselves. Whereas we know that mostly came afterwards their push into Pixar films and their own attempts at 3D animation that gave way to the studio that we know today. I mean, this is by all means a great Disney film, an interesting twist on a classic that Disney actually did first in live action with Treasure Island, which was their first ever live action film and now presented in animation with a story taking place in space with an 18th century twist added onto it. The future virtually taking place in the past, and the story's heart really relies on the father-son relationship with Silver and Jim Hawkins, where there is really nothing to suggest that this film is by any means bad or deserved of the flop that it was, because in reality, the film that was released in the same year was in fact Lilo and Stitch, my favorite film of all time, which of course the release of Treasure Planet was wedged in the middle of big films like Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, something that could only result in such a disaster for a movie being released in the same time frame. Of course, the speculation behind it is not 100% fact by any means, but just looking at that sort of release schedule where they already had an animated film that performed well before this and other blockbusters that were released proves something darker behind the executive decisions that the company was facing. How they saw this new direction where Pixar was introducing us to films like Toy Story and Monsters Inc., and how their successes actually saw a new opportunity for them to move in a different direction and disrespect and throw 2D animation in the trash. And like I say, I didn't think it was wrong for them to move into this new style, as DreamWorks actually started to do so with Shrek, where in their case, their 2D just couldn't stand up consistently to the standards of Disney and coming under the umbrella of the company that was pioneering new technologies in storytelling. But then when you're going back into this very moment, you realize it shows an ignorance of what actually works in storytelling that they refuse to go back towards nowadays. And I think this is a problem that started with Atlantis. Maybe Emperor's New Groove to some extent because of its troubled production, but just mainly the box office disappointment that Atlantis was that really took Disney out of the musicals that the Renaissance mainly did, which style of course continued with such successes in Lilo and Stitch, but then went back to disappointments in Treasure Planet. This entire era of Disney films that followed the Renaissance were mostly anything but disappointments in my opinion, excluding of course Home on the Range and Dinosaur in that instance, where films like Dinosaur on the other hand were the first instance of Disney animation trying to go for photorealism that was actually counted under Disney animation as they still made it, compared to something like The Lion King that would be released later, which is the same computer animated type of film, which the difference between those films is the fact that Dinosaur actually used real life backgrounds, where in the case of The Lion King everything is fake and is still not as counted as that animated film because they like to say that it is live action. But back to the point I'm trying to make is that most of these normal 2D animated films were not bad overall, where they had some of my most favorite Disney films of all time, but it was still amidst the transition that they wanted to abandon this altogether, which I hated and advocate for bringing back in one of my previous videos, which I hardly understood even more with these very films, especially in Treasure Planet where they used CGI for the spaceport and the ships, which already proved how well it could have worked to blend in both animation styles, which apparently now they're starting to go back a little bit, but still kept within the overall same character model designs they have for the past decade, because the very next year after Treasure Planet is when they released Brother Bear as a film that actually went on to become a success that grossed $250 million, about $140 million more than Treasure Planet, where various issues including the CGI scenes made the budget to $110 million, which gives more credence to the argument that they tanked it on purpose, because the very same year as Brother Bear was released was also Pixar's Finding Nemo, which was the second highest grossing film of that entire year, behind Lord of the Rings yet again, furthering the proof that they needed to abandon this style to fully commit to 3D. I mean not fully, but just planting the seeds in their mind where they wouldn't fully switch until Winnie the Pooh was finally released. A movie that I have actually forgotten to mention in my previous videos due to it being based on a character that has already like a dozen films before this, because The Princess and the Frog was the last original animated film actually still done by directors Musker and Clements, who directed Treasure Planet 2 and went on to create one of Disney's best 3D animated films in Moana. Like seriously, the talent these guys have is immeasurable. The Great Mouse Detective, beginning the renaissance with The Little Mermaid, continuing with another classic in Aladdin, almost closing it out with Hercules, then Treasure Planet, Princess and the Frog, and finally Moana. The most successful track record I have ever seen in Disney in their entire history, and hope that they can still continue to create something special if they choose to, which it still makes no sense for Treasure Planet being released the way it was for these guys that were actually behind it. A summer movie that was released at the wrong time during the season of the winter blockbusters of the year. A similar mistake that I actually now found with Atlantis as well, where of course it was in the summer and other factors to why people weren't as interested in it, but overall at the same time it was still due to the releases of Shrek and Tomb Raider within that same time frame that had more attention to it, because you know Shrek was 3D and Atlantis was only partially. But then again, I guess Disney didn't care for this because you know they helped to produce the Pixar films like Monsters Inc. released during the same year, which actually made more money than Shrek, where at the very least they should have just delayed Atlantis a month further to probably make more money. And just looking at the release schedules within these other films of these very years, which I was just a small baby, is actually appalling to think about. It's like they treated their adopted son with high regard because he got all A's rather than their real biological son that got all the B's instead. Where once again we saw the disappointment of Home on the Range, where Disney did decide to dip their toes personally into 3D with shit-tastic films like Chicken Little, but then improved when they made Meet the Robinsons and so forth, where Tangled actually hit the spot to stick with this new style after closing out with 2D with Winnie the Pooh, where I still remain hopeful because after they released Frozen 2, Jennifer Lee actually confirmed that there will be possibilities for hand-drawn animation to return, which is hopeful, but then again it was said about 4 years ago at this point, where even though Wish is doing something unique, it still is mainly stuck within the revival character design and nothing very drastically different to my knowledge. And then going back to the birth of this time period is the same exact year that Disney went back to live action in Alice in Wonderland after taking a long hiatus after the Dalmatian films. Its success is the one that spurred Disney to remake their films, where at the very first it started out with the older 50s films like Maleficent and of course Cinderella, where most were well received by the public during this time, inspiring to go after more like The Jungle Book and finally Beauty and the Beast. Each release actually kept on getting more successful each time the younger the film started out, culminating in the release of The Lion King. Of course, at the time with films before The Lion King, most of them were seen as a gesture of tribute to increase such appreciation in those older animated films if you did or didn't like them, and had new opportunities for younger generations to interact with the older stories, making some changes here and there, where the more successful you actually noticed the film to be, the more they started to just rip off the originals and make the occasional minor changes of perceived problematic problems in the film, the things that hardly understood what the original was trying to get across, and of course finally the horrible CG animation for these animals and non-human elements of the film that made it more gross and unbelievable for something that tried to be live action. Like they use animation to degrade animation now, where instead of involving real animals to a large degree, they always CGI it in. I mean, you had real horses in your films, but then moved on to fake cats and fake monkeys because you know it's just too hard to get a real monkey as a Boo because the animation of the original has to be expressive, where this gets us back to the point of The Lion King. This is the movie that broke all reasoning for Disney's live action and has a disrespect to animation that I presented in the title by having something like the original Lion King now be photorealistic. Still animation, but more real, and why it contributes to that opinion about why they hate animation, because they use a different kind of animation to adapt that other type of animation. And this doesn't take away from the works of the animators do on this film, because due to the amount of work that they put in, which is impressive and a work of art on their own, but when you put that into perspective of certain characters translated within real, it completely takes away all meaning from what was. Because if you look back at what they're trying to attempt to do, they are admitting that they were trying to make something that says live action rather than animation. They were using animation for this film to make something real, and that is a fact that hardly respects anything from before, no matter how hard you try to spin it. And of course, as a result, this film gave us the something with the most hollow shell of a movie movie that you could ever see. Nothing here was ever justified being made, and the fact that you tried to make it realistic made the film 10 times worse for something that didn't even make any sense. I mean, no matter how good you think some of the actors might be delivering their lines, you certainly do not feel that expressed on the screen, with these very animals just moving their mouths, and that is virtually it. Where somehow this film just had to make $1.6 billion at the box office and is getting a prequel/sequel next year because of how successful this was. That type of money told Disney that people was willing to see any and all related to their older films that they could just redo. Once again, a newer era to try to justify switching to this type of film genre that they saw back in the early 2000s by deliberately setting up Treasure Planet to fail, and now finally seeing an opportunity to revamp their older movies in a realistic style. But like I said, this should serve as no disrespect to any of the VFX artists who spend time working on the creature effects, because I already see how impressive that is, but overall to a pre-established work is hardly respectful to me at all. It's just how they tried to justify any new decision from the original as pertaining to that's not exactly what happens to real life, so let's make everything 10 times worse. Like really, the logic behind such decisions are truly astonishing because it all came from that perceived success of the earlier remade films commercially and critically. Like, you have to seriously take the executive thoughts into account. Like, if we can recreate some of our films to be real, maybe we can do that for an entire movie that doesn't involve something remotely real like animals talking compared to humans, because that's an idea that just can't work. Once again, we mentioned we drop things like Treasure Planet to create films like this instead, where I'm sure you totally see my point of this video here, right? It's the same thing that can be said for The Lady and the Tramp, where despite being both real and fake, it all just looks terribly awful because you know they don't exist, instead of having those real animals with their animated mouths that other Disney productions like Beverly Hills Chihuahua did. Like literally, those are real animals that Disney actually forgot to use in these remakes, where instead they just decide to animate them like we did before, but to make them realistic because animals cannot do the things they did in the original animated films. Like seriously, you can make everything 10 times worse because you already choose to do this instead of that. I mean, why? These past films are live action films, so at the very least, they should have at least mainly used live action dogs for films like this. But that's just something Disney does not want to do, further destroying any meaning to animation like in Mulan. I am putting this movie into the conversation because just like The Lion King, they wanted to make this movie more real while removing some of the elements of the film that could have been real, and of course replacing animated characters with another character who can turn into a bird, like if that actually made any sense at all. It's this combination that really destroys everything about the original's meaning throughout the main message and power that Mulan has. It doesn't justify anything to empower the main character, erasing any build-up that tried to get her to certain points as to what the animation did for her originally to show her strengths and weaknesses that makes her as a character. Any meaning that you derive from the original is not there anymore, and it clearly shows on Disney's part. Time and time again, with Peter Pan, the same thing actually comes up that misses the important lessons that were being derived with the original because they just want to make it fresh and new and up to date with the times for some reason. Another clear mark for the perceived hatred is not designing the Little Mermaid characters properly. I mean, why would you design Sebastian to look like a ghost crab? What reason do you have for making him the wrong type of crab who can't live underwater? And why are you making a character like Scuttle breathe underwater? What choice is that supposed to make that the original didn't offer by having that animated character connect Ariel with the surface world? I know this could actually apply to any choice of an original work or film, but in regards to what they did in the first place with that particular style and animation, it just sets up how much they are missing the mark in regards to that, which is all marketed towards pioneering film techniques to make it unique in its own right. You know, like it says in the description, it's all about bringing these films to life, right? Suggesting that they already didn't do that in the original. Every word they make and every decision that these films do does not give any respect, no matter how much you actually try to spin it positively to add on. I mean, despite people saying it makes people go back to the original, that was already something you could do already because of its availability to watch at home. You didn't need to have this to sell you that point, and you certainly didn't need to switch styles to fully commit to that. It's also a point that stagnates your own animation when two of your biggest animated studios start to look very similar in animated style that brings in more photorealism to your movies, or just not being as distinguishable as each other. Once again, bringing up Ralph Breaks the Internet as a film designed by committee and extend Frozen 2 in that way, where Disney was pushing these familiar properties and characters on a set timetable and schedule that they have already been used to. And in this instance, I want to primarily focus on the part of the Disney section of the film. The most painful self-absorbed scene ever created, where some of the design of the characters in the internet look weirdly awful in some cases. Not fully, because I still appreciate this style of animation, but sometimes the characters that are even 3D originally look so weird, like Buzz Lightyear, because of course the two studios are different, or yeah, even characters like Pocahontas and Tiana, where comparing it to her own original film to Ralph's, it looks very super odd and gives credence to the argument that some characters can only look great in the style that they were introduced. Like seriously, look at these characters and tell me which one is better. I mean, not to bring any disrespect to the people who designed this, but these choices, although minor, really does not serve any great respect to what they were adapting in the first place. I mean, if that wasn't enough, I really have to go back to what I said in the review of the movie, of how like live action, it yet again doesn't respect any of the original films. Like Belle saying kidnapped and enslaved when she actually did that willingly to free her father, which surprised the Beast in the film, or having Rapunzel make those female empowering statements about a big strong man to save the day when that wasn't the case in the original Tangled. Like the whole point about this isn't just about Disney hating animation on the surface level, like they just don't want to do it. You now would see it goes deeper into retelling their stories with different hollow meanings because it doesn't require much effort to focus on the storytelling aspect of the film. They're not focusing on that idea, they're writing in something that doesn't need to be said. But I still don't doubt their abilities, because recent films like Encanto can prove otherwise, where I've really enjoyed those stories retaining the uniqueness and still hopeful about what Wish can bring. But overall, when they just came out of their 3D animated success and made Ralph, they completely missed the mark on everything that came before it. I mean, it is truly baffling that this film should have an 88% on Rotten Tomatoes or a 64% audience score. There's no reason that should have it at all for what it did. Like literally go back to the original guys and compare it. You will see that night and day difference. And then finally, to kill all of this was the announcement of Moana for the film that wasn't even a decade old at this point, with The Rock spearheading all of this, and it really shows us that they have no real damn respect for any animation they do making a film in live action because they can, and not paying any deep respect for a film that almost animates its elements to look real around the film. Like nothing is ever enough for these sick twisted psychos anymore. And if you didn't agree with my notion of them hating animation, then I'm really sure you do now because of something as twisted as this very announcement for their very first 3D film being adapted into live action. Like, do you really understand that? Most people understood previous remakes because most of them were 2D traditional animated films being brought into a realistic setting, and now you're going to do it for your CGI films that was released during the past decade, and now you're bringing it back. So understanding these points that started in this very century are very crucial pieces to show you how much Disney has undervalued their own history this much in the 21st century alone. It's a piece I've tried to explain in so many ways since I made my first animation problem video, and will forever keep doing this if it means Disney would at least go back to the roots of storytelling in the most spectacular of fashion. It's just that this is a company that built itself upon making history in animation, perfecting it and inspiring many great works around the world beyond itself in a medium of storytelling that nowadays are just too big and forgoes anything that made them special. I know I repeat myself a lot, but that is just the reality that I am presented with, and I hope at least one person can see that and make the change for the better. And with that said, I'm all done, so goodbye.